is the first ever attempt at the Robin's Ramblings podcast. It's a little bit weird because I can only see myself on the screen, so I'm going to look this way so that I can acknowledge that John is here, the other Robin, Robbins.
Yeah, John Robbins.
Yeah. We spoke about doing some play on his surname being like my first name, but it's actually quite complicated to make it obvious what we're doing without just using my name.
And also, it would sound a little lame, wouldn't it? Like Robbins.
the two Robins.
Yeah.
Does it sound like we're just like
the Rambling Robbins?
Yeah,
the Rambling Robbins.
Yeah, with the apostrophe in brackets to make it unclear as to. Yeah, it's not easy to do it in a way that's actually comprehensible to the average person, and would just seem like some cheesy in-joke between us. But anyway, so I haven't put anything out podcast-wise yet. This is going to become hopefully an extension to the blog, but I'm still figuring it out. It might turn into multiple different shows with different people. It might turn into one show with a variety of different people. Who knows? We have got a couple of topics that we sort of pinned, but we're going to see how it goes organically. Do you want to go with the slightly more silly debate first, or do you want to talk about the more serious one and then ease it off with the parsnip?
I don't really mind. We can start with a discussion about the Great Parsnip Debate. I think it's quite interesting. It sounds silly, but when you start going down into it, it's almost potentially really worrying.
Yeah. So for context, me and John both work in social care. John is probably, I don't know, how long have you been a social worker for?
Since the 11th of November 2013.
That's very specific. Have you got?
Everyone remembers their first day.
Do they? Okay. I remember my first day, but my first day in supported housing. But it's fairly hard to remember a day like that because I was there for about 6 hours, and in that time we had one overdose and someone trying to kick in the office door. And as I left, there was an ambulance and a police car screaming down the road towards where I was coming from to deal with all the issues that I was running away from on my first day. And then when I turned up on the second day, they were like, "Oh my God, you've come back."
So like, yeah, this was fun. It's exciting. Sad, but exciting.
I couldn't give you the date, though. I just know what happened in great detail. And interestingly, actually, what the guy who was trying to kick in the office door got evicted from that property, and then 4 years later, when I went over to leaving care, he got allocated to me again. And I was like, I've met you once before. You were trying to kick in the office door and I was holding it shut.
And had he changed? Was he like, yeah, man, I'm sorry, I was going through some stuff?
He wasn't sorry. He changed some ways for the better in that he was less aggressive towards staff, but there were lots of ways in which he hadn't changed for the better either. It's not a positive story. Well,
I'm probably one that we shouldn't really get into, but there is one of the things in social care is you're looking for any positive steps forward, no matter how small, to build on, isn't it? Like it's very hard to create change.
Self-delusion.
Yes. Could be one way.
No, I mean, I think there's a balance to be struck, isn't there, between looking for positives. And I find that naturally, although I say naturally, I wasn't like this when I was younger, but over the last few years, I had an interesting conversation with someone recently, and this sort of relates into the later topic around domestic abuse. But I was having this conversation with someone, and this person had experienced some domestic abuse in their life, and the way they spoke about something. So I recently returned my first ever clean DBS check of my life. So it's been 15 years since my first ever arrest, and I was 16 at the time, and then I was 19 when I got my first adult conviction. and I didn't need any DBS checks 18 to 19. So my entire life, I've had a DBS that's shown up a record on every single time, and it's led to me losing jobs. It's led to me having months and months of delays of starting a new job. I always have to have meetings with managers and explain everything. So I returned this clean DBS, and I actually felt a little bit emotional about this, because I was like, this is huge. Like this obstacle is gone, and hopefully my life should be slightly easier from now on. I'm now at the average starting point for a 16-year-old in life at 31 years old. But the way they spoke about it was they were very positive, and they were like, you know, you've been through these things, but you overcome your circumstance, your choices don't define you, and things like that. And there was this real redemption narrative to it. And I remember an ex-partner sending me a very long time ago this this article that spoke about narratives and how we narrate our lives. And it was a little bit pop psychology, you know. It wasn't it's not something that can be tested, it's not something to be proven, but I do think it has its use as a framework in some ways. And it was basically saying that there's sort of two ways that people look at themselves. They either view themselves as victims, or they view themselves through so they paint their narrative as that of a victim or that of redemption, which is basically like either I guess it's sort of related to the locus of control, you know, either external things are happening to me and I'm just a victim of the world around me, or actually I'm in control and things get put in my way, but I work my way through them and I'm going to achieve regardless. And that's sort of the way it's looking. But the thing that I noticed in this was that she projected a redemption narrative onto my story because she holds a redemption narrative of herself. And the same thing happened to me, because I very definitely saw myself as a victim for many, many years. And what I was actually doing in that was trying to avoid personal responsibility, but that's a tangent that I'm going to try and avoid going off on. For the record, I've had very little sleep, so if I get a bit more rambly than usual and I'm forgetting what I'm talking about, that is why. But I noticed that as I adapted my view and my narrative of my own life and started to see myself not as someone who was a victim of their circumstance, but of someone who prevailed regardless of their circumstance, I started to become more strengths-based, we would call it, in my outlook on other people's lives. So because I saw my life more like that, I saw other people's lives more like that. And I'm very, very, when I work with clients, I'm very, very strengths-based naturally. Like, it's not a conscious thing. I find the theory behind it's a bit wishy-washy from a social work perspective, but
with very little evidence as well.
Well, yeah, it's and it gets,
but it feels the right way.
Yeah, well, social work does that quite a lot. They're like, this sounds like a good idea, let's do it. Who cares if we can prove whether it works or not, or anything like that? But
we are trying to improve that with organisations like What Works in Children's Social Care that are going out and doing experiments and trying to build an evidence base for things we are already doing. So we're getting there, we're catching up slowly, but it's definitely been many years of neglect on that topic. But we're going off on a slight tangent.
No, and I think there is there's an issue with the way that research is done in social work quite often. I've noticed this with some of my professors, and when I've been reading through some of the research. Social work is so far from a science in the way that it operates. We tend to only use qualitative data, and there's not a huge amount of quantitative. And part of that is, you know, it's very difficult to measure these things accurately, although I think we could measure a lot better. I think we could learn a lot from psychology in that regard, although psychology is still developing its measurement capabilities. But there's a lot of people who take an ideological position and basically go, I think this would be a good idea. I'm going to collect feedback saying how useful my idea was, and I'm going to call that research. I know that I had a professor, and she was, I believe she's responsible for teaching us our research methods whenever that comes around. And she spoke of this project she'd set up and was like, oh yeah, and I've been doing research into it and it's been really effective. And I was basically like, so you set up a project that was your idea and then you asked everyone if they liked it, and when they said yes, you called that research, was like the impression I got. So anyway, yeah, this has completely gone off on a tangent.
It has. But it can bring us back into a discussion on domestic abuse, because then we'll be giving our views with very limited research base.
Yeah,
but it is baby steps forward. I think that's part of the thing. Like, it's you can't, you don't go from like a Spitfire to like a modern aeroplane without all those steps in between. And as long as we're on that right journey, you just keep plugging away, keep improving. It wasn't that long ago medicine was not really having much of an evidence base, but the complexities in life and in social work, I think in many ways do make it quite hard, and some of the lack of investment in funding social research can make it a bit harder sometimes to really build a real drive in towards improving that quality.
Yeah, it's definitely complicated. I think we could learn a lot from other social sciences, and I think sometimes we're a bit too keen to see ourselves as something separate. Like, I know in America that psychology and social work are a lot more closely linked than they are here, and I actually think that that's a positive thing, because I think to me, a lot of what we do is just a form of psychological intervention, except out in the community. I mean, I know we do more than that, and this might just be that my approach, because my interest is psychology, but I find that when I'm working with people, 90% of what I do is psychologically informed, and then the rest of it is sort of like knowing how the various systems around them work, which wouldn't be inherently psychological, but a lot of that's very policy and legislation driven. And one of the things that when I'm reading about social work theories, a lot of the time, everyone's quick to say, well, don't blame the person, blame society. Like, look at all the problems that are going on. And I'm being slightly hyperbolic with the way I represent that, but they have these almost utopian ideas that it's like, okay, so I'll give an example from a development day not that long ago. Someone said, well, this person's struggling to get to a laundrette, but that's because there's not any laundrettes in the community, and so on and so forth, and we need to be doing something about that. And I was like, realistically, as a social worker, what can I do to establish a laundrette? And my initial thought was, if you feel that strongly there needs to be a laundrette in this community, nothing is stopping you from starting your own laundrette.
Yes. I mean, that does sound like quite an extreme example, but you do need to, I think there is value in the idea of systems theory, and that you have lots of things that are going on around you in society that do make certain things harder for some people, and access to certain resources, whether it's a laundrette or something else, and just the people around you and what they're up to, and like the level of advice that they're able to provide to you. Like, all these things feed in, and that just adds to that complexity. But you are also very right, is that actually when you're trying to implement change with someone, it's quite often understanding who they are and trying to unpick what their own internal psychological barriers are to those change. Like, if there is a parent that's neglecting a child, like, what is their barrier? What is it that's leading them to do that? Because if it was as simple as walking in and being like, right, well, just make sure you bath them every day and walk out, like, problem solved. But it's not, is it? There's something there behind it, like their own depression, something that's happened to them as a child that they can't get over, or even as an adult that's really putting up barriers. And they probably know that they're not meeting those needs, but just aren't able to make that change. And that's where you're right, like that level of psychology training does seem to be better in America. They have a lot more training that they go through there, and it is something that we probably need to improve in time again in this country.
they also have a higher level of qualification necessary to work as a social worker. You have to have your masters if you want to work there. But there was something interesting you were saying in there that I think brings us onto the topic that we were actually intended to talk about, because you said about understanding what's going on for people. And one of the things that I get drafted into quite a lot, and I have been for a very long time, I suspect part of this is down... I mean, I don't say that I've been completely pigeonholed into this, but I suspect that there is generally a thing in social care where they're like, we've got one man in the team, we need some domestic abuse work doing with a man, maybe it would be better if it comes from our male member of staff. And so I do feel like people's first thought is, let's get Robin in. But that's fine. And when I've been doing this, I've been looking through a lot of the resources we use for working with both perpetrators and victims of domestic abuse. And one thing that I think is very clear to me, at least, when I'm reading through it, is that it doesn't understand where someone is coming from. And I think that I mean, there's a lot of research out there and a lot of evidence to show that social work is biased in favour of women against men. I don't know how you want to represent it. I don't want to present it as a sort of zero-sum game between men and women, but
the reason why it's probably easy to put that out there is because the lack of research and the lack of knowing what to do with male perpetrators of domestic abuse, and because domestic abuse perpetrators are predominantly, but not all male, like we have to make sure we really highlight that because we're like, what do we do? Like it kind of then the outcomes present is that we're being very female supportive and like always looking to support the female and the child. And then some of the problems that come from breaking up like a family there and removing a male role model for their life, because even domestic abuse perpetrators, some of them can have good qualities for a child, which is why often that we don't always advocate, well, you can just never have contact with your dad again. Like that's just whacking it with a sledgehammer, isn't it? But I think from what you're saying kind of neatly goes into something that I've been thinking for a while, which again, I've got no real evidence base for, but to me, I always feel that a lot of the things that happen around males becoming abusive probably comes down to their own self-esteem and back into some of their own psychological needs that aren't being met. But a lot of resources or programs, from my understanding, tend to focus more upon helping them to act differently, but not necessarily digging that next day level deeper and really understanding like, well, why do you feel you need this like level of control? What is it that if you feel, because I think probably a lot of us have felt it, like if you're in a relationship and you feel your relationship's falling down and falling apart around you, you feel like that hole in your stomach of, how do I fix this? Like the loss of something that you love so much, it feels like your stomach's being ripped out, and naturally you're like, I can't handle that, I don't want that. And for some people, like it then leads them potentially into that level of control and feeling that and using violence to try and hold something together, and not even realizing that then what they're actually holding together is not a relationship that they wanted in the first place. But it's understanding how they kind of work through their own internal emotions to respect like someone and be like, okay, well, if this is over or you're having paranoias that they're doing something, well, you can't control that. That's not, you're going to have to learn to ride these waves of emotion like through in a more like positive and constructive way. And I don't think we really touch on that. And I was listening to a BBC, I'm sure it was a BBC podcast all about domestic abuse programs, and they were finding that actually the success rate of them are very small. And it was being presented by a guy that had been through one of these programs, and he was really interested in unpicking it and finding that actually, yeah, a lot of people do just learn new ways of abusing women, and it isn't addressing like their own internal needs. And some of the programs that they were finding that were working was actually around building barriers up to prevent these people abusing, which also isn't really a great system. So it's just kind of almost like isolating them away from women. And you're like, okay, well, that may well work in the fact that they can't access anyone to abuse. But again, it's not actually helping them. Like, so it's around, we need better understanding of how to actually help these people.
Yeah, so I have a lot of thoughts coming off of that. And one thing that I want to respond to something you said very early on in that about the gender balance of the violence. I was reading some research recently. I've come across it a few times. It's a few years old. It's American based. But so most of our domestic abuse stats in this country come from police reports.
Yeah.
So it's the number of it's not the number of offences that occur, it's the number of offences that are reported to the police, and then outcomes, and then estimates from that. There may be other data out there that I'm not aware of that's being collected. I don't know.
Meaning you haven't read everything?
Yeah.
You haven't read the internet, Robin.
It turns out that I haven't read every single research paper ever, no matter how many conversations I start with. Well, actually, there's some research on that. So this was US based, and what they did, they were studying intimate partner violence, and they asked people, if I remember rightly, the age group was 18 to 30 or 18 to 25. It was something. Cool. So it's a reasonably young age group. Yeah, young adult.
Age. Yeah.
And they asked them about violence within their relationship. So they're getting it self-report, but there's no bias, because one of the things that I think with that data that it relies on police reports is men are significantly less likely to report things to the police. Men have a 40% upper body strength on average advantage over women. So when men are violent towards women, there's a significant impact comparatively. Not that makes any difference to the morality of the violence. And so people are obviously more likely to report an assault that causes injury than they are if someone, if someone slapped you and it just gave you a little bit of a red face, you'd not bother calling the police because it's more time than it's worth. If someone stabs you, you're probably going to call the police because it's a bit more serious. And I guess that's to do with us scaling our morality in terms of how much we think that an action needs to be deterred. But that's a whole other topic.
But a very good, good point.
So of this research, they found that 2/3 of victims were women and 1/3 were men, which is already, I think it was 1,000 female victims and 500 male victims, which is already a far more balanced figure than we ever get in this country in terms of the reports of figures. So 71% of perpetrators of non-reciprocal violence, so someone who's using violence against their partner and their partner's not using that, 71% of them were women. And that's by reports from both the women and the men. In cases of reciprocal violence, it was something, I can't remember the exact figures for this now, but because we usually promote this idea that any reciprocal violence on the part of the victim is self-defense. When these women were asked about it, it was like less than 10% of them who engaged in reciprocal violence said that it was self-defense. So they did not consider it as defending themselves. They considered it as a sort of volatile relationship. And this is one of the things that I keep coming across when I'm working with domestic abuse, is that it's not, I mean, sometimes it is the individual, but quite often it's a result of a dynamic. And I can think back on my own relationships and be like, there are relationships I've had that have been a lot less healthy, and those have massively increased the levels of insecurity I felt, the levels of anxiety. You know, like there's been more volatility in that relationship, and I'm not a volatile person.
Yeah. You're not admitting domestic abuse.
No, I'm not. I'm not admitting any domestic abuse. But there have been relationships that have had a more volatile element to them, and that has been a result of the two personalities playing into each other. We've brought out the worst aspects of each other rather than the best. And then I've had other relationships where we've basically never had an argument, or like we've had little arguments, but they've been like fairly easy to resolve and over things that you have to argue about as part of being in a couple. Like, if someone says they don't have arguments, either they're lying or their relationship's doomed. There is actual research on that shows it's something like you have to have at least one negative interaction for every dozen positive interactions or something like that. And if it gets any more positive to negative, if the ratio gets too skewed towards the positive, it's a negative predictor of relationship success.
Yes. No, I've heard of that before. I don't know much about the research behind that, but I have heard that. But there's some really interesting points in there. One of the things that stood out, I guess, was when you were mentioning about what's worth reporting. And I mean, it sounds almost very contentious in some ways, but like that there is.
I like contentious. John.
Yes, I know you do. There is always a degree of some form of domestic abuse, I guess, that will always go on, and we won't be able to change and fix. And I mean, it sounds it sounds horrible, but it's almost like that there'll be a tolerated level in some relationships in society because people aren't phoning in, are they? Like if it is just if there is a common assault level slap across the face, will some people phone that in, male or female? Ooh, that's the novice in me hitting the mic. But the thing that we always assess in social work, isn't it, is what's the impact of that and the severity and then the risk around it. And something, I guess, those lower levels, we would obviously be advising that, like, you know, it's not right, trying to offer some support, but it would be considered something that might potentially be, you know, unfortunately in that tolerable area. But what you were saying there about men being victims, 100%, like we're nowhere near understanding that. And is that potentially like there is shame is something that's been brought up many times, like of this idea of what a man should be, so they accept it. And then there's the kind of next layers of it, because we've focused a lot on violence, but what about like the manipulation and control and things like that? We wonder how much of that we're really understanding and is coming out in some of these reports from female to male. And in reality, it's only often coming across our desks in social care when it is at a really significant level. And quite often then it isn't just violence, there is manipulation, there is control really significantly in it as well, and obviously impact on the kids, which is what we're looking at. So you kind of wonder how much is going unreported, and what would be interesting in those figures is to understand how many men are actually victims of that high level stuff that is
non-physical.
Not physical, but also less impactful, and that's a better word than tolerable, like, because even as I say that, it makes myself cringe, but that like in the impact of it may not be as big. Obviously, as you were saying, over time these things can build up and have a really significant impact, but unless like we've got cameras and control over everybody's lives, like some of these things are gonna go round and round and round. But what we want to really focus on is trying to somehow break that cycle of like where it's really significant and massively impactful.
Well, one of the things that I'm thinking of instantly off of that is that I wouldn't be surprised in the slightest if when we reach a point where we're somehow able to get that data without massively infringing on everyone's civil liberties, that once we're able to get that data, I would not be surprised if we saw a far more balanced, if not approaching 50-50 level of domestic abuse instances. Because if you look at male patterns of violence, male violence tends to be far more physical, and female violence tends to follow the pattern of reputation destruction. So it would be psychological violence probably more than physical violence, and you see that a lot with there's a few people that I've read a fair bit of research on developmental aggression, and I know that one of the things is that instances of aggression peak at around 18 to 24 months. That's the peak of aggression in everyone's life, and and it declines from there on out, because people often think of adolescence as the sort of most violent, but actually, if you just count, I think they measured it on kicks, hits, bites, and steals.
I mean, having two kids myself, they're relatively young. I still remember them at that age, and I think you're right, actually. Yeah. You don't really see it or acknowledge it, and it's very well accepted, because you're like, well, you're a baby, you don't really know what you're doing, but yeah.
And it causes no harm, because
exactly,
they're like that
yeah.
big.
The kicks, the bites, that frustration as they're trying to learn in life, like their own like rules and what they can and can't do, and yeah.
But we quite often think of violence as something that people are socialised into, but that research suggests it's something we're socialised out of, because basically violence peaks the moment you gain the coordination to throw a punch, and then declines over time. And there are a small number of people who are exceptionally violent who remain exceptionally violent, but even their levels of violence decline over time. And I think it's about it's usually around 25, I think. 25 to 30 is when aggression tends to drop off quite steeply, which is coincidentally, probably not coincidentally, around the time that identity consolidation tends to slow down quite significantly. You tend to be fairly concrete in your identity from 25 onwards.
I guess there's also, though, throwing in on that is the input of trauma. Like at any point in life, and especially probably in that early development, that, you know, if you do receive some significant incident of trauma, in many ways, like you trying to control your emotions, like, as we know, like we've all been through periods of stress when like you
every damn day.
Yeah, and it's harder to control your emotions, and you know, we're constant, like you say, we're socialized out of it, learning to keep a lid on it, understanding actually a better way of getting on with people is through healthy communication. But when you throw in significant trauma in there and emotions are running high and you're becoming fixed in a fight or flight mode, you can't get out of it, you can end up relying more on violence without even really wanting to. A lot of the time, you like the amount of times I've heard like children say to me, like, I don't want to do this. The red mist comes down, and they find out that they've had some form of trauma without going into it, and you like.
So putting those things together, though, I think that one of the ways that we tend to narrate it is that they've had trauma, and this trauma creates a response that generates more violence. It could be that the trauma or the whatever experience it is has impacted on their development, so prevented them from being socialized out of the aggression. So all it's done is delayed that development away from aggression rather than causing an increase in aggression. I mean, I'm speculating here, because you would have to look at research data that measured aggression and factored in adverse childhood experiences and saw if aggression increased or just decreased at a slower rate. And also, I think that research exists yet, either that or I haven't read it, because again, I haven't read everything ever. Also,
I guess, like, following that narrative thing, like I was understanding you making the presumption that like trauma had happened around that age, like so whereas I was kind of thinking, well, that could have happened at any point, like in your life you could receive trauma of some significant degree. Like, what if I go out like tonight and get significantly, I don't know, beaten up? I might not be the best example because I'm more of a hugger, but like some people, like,
someone
they
might just really dislike your face.
Yes, exactly. But you know, it would take a long time to probably get over, and you'd struggle and have your own emotional journey as a result of that. Now, probably because I'm more of a hugger and fighter, I probably more take that introverted way. But like some other people may struggle with that, to hold on those emotions, and do have violent outbursts because they're struggling to work through what has happened to them, and then that could be a result of why they're being aggressive.
Well, this sort of to some degree brings us back to the domestic abuse point where we started, because so Schofield, I don't know how you say his name, he's done written several papers about social work. He's a social work academic that so far I quite like, which is a miracle. But he's hypothesized that the widespread adoption of feminist ideology within social work, I mean, it is presumed that everyone adheres to feminist ideology within social work, and I suspect you would make yourself vastly unpopular if you were to question feminist ideology within social work.
To be honest, I'm not 100% sure if I could even define what feminist ideology is.
Okay, so the feminist ideology I'm referring to would be the belief that the world or society is organised patriarchally, and that men fulfill an oppressive role that grants them privilege over women, and women are oppressed by men.
I would say that there is a degree of being aware of that, but I think good social workers aren't driven by that. Like, I think there's enough stuff out there, like kind of highlighting that it is generally easier for most men in life. I mean, I would almost say white
I'd contest
men.
that. But...
You might contest that, but I think just looking at like my own friendships groups, you know, it's not me that's like given birth to my kids. It's not me that's had to take that time out. Like, I've been able to keep my head down and keep working alongside. Like, I do a lot. Like, I'm quite a bit of a modern man, and
a flip side to that though
setbacks.
Is how many men are out there who would rather be spending the time with their kids than working to provide for their kids and wife. So one of the things that feeds into this quite a lot to me, and this is why I see it as a cooperative thing where both people are making sacrifices and not a clear imbalance. If you look cross-culturally at the choices that women and men make, and you rank it by how egalitarian the societies are, so the Scandinavian countries have done the most of any society ever to try and equalise things for men and women, including the way that they operate maternity/paternity pay. They've made it so that it's far easier for women to stay in the workforce and for men to opt to stay at home. And overwhelmingly, a couple, when given a free choice, the woman will choose to stay at home and the man will choose to go to work. And this happens to a more extreme degree. The differences between men and women, certain differences.
Here we go. That's quite a comment, right? From a white male.
The main differences that we can evidence between men and women temperamentally become more exaggerated in societies that are more egalitarian, and so that suggests that they're innate differences rather than socialized differences. Because if they were socialized differences, then the more egalitarian societies would make the differences less pronounced.
Well, I think to start with, I'm not going to pretend that I am a woman and has been through everything. And so I'm not going to, overly try and say like, oh, they're feeling this, they're feeling that, because I've not felt it, I'm not there. But kind of what you're highlighting almost proves a degree of the point that we need to be aware of, is that we don't have those systems in our country. And so we should be taking that on board, that actually there are certain systems that aren't necessarily making it fair. So some things can be harder for women as a result of that. Like, we've come a long way, but I do think we've still got a long way to go to make it fairer. And I do think we need to have some sort of awareness of that, but it shouldn't necessarily be the overriding factor. We can't go in and just be very much like, oh, like you're a female, you're being oppressed completely by society, because you're not. You will be. There'll be all these, what are the modern words, like micro oppressions and things, but they build up over time. And there are, I think there are things that are different, and different challenges that we face. And until we change some of the systems and laws, we are, I would say, living in a society here in Britain today that is probably predominantly easier for a white male to navigate than not.
This is one of the things that I thought would be interesting about us doing a podcast together, because I think we have quite different views on this.
Yeah.
And I don't know to what degree that this is the time and place to go into them in depth. I'm hoping we have many more opportunities for discussions and we don't have to hash it out at the first opportunity. But I would argue that, yes, there are different challenges for men and women in certain areas. I don't think that there will ever be identical challenges for men and women, because I don't think men and women are the same. I think we're more the same than we're different, but we still have differences. And I think that one of the things that we often get confused around is we look at everything as outcomes when we're looking at it. So, like the gender pay gap is like a classic example. People talk about that, but quite a lot of analysis has been done on the gender pay gap, and people go, well, on average, women earn, I think it's 9% or 7%, something like that, less than men, and that's true. But average earnings, if you just compare those based on one variable, you're not getting any sort of picture of what's causing it. And when you actually look at it more closely, women tend to make up a lot of the middle of earnings, and men make up a lot at the bottom. So a lot of minimum wage jobs are produced men. Men also tend to have the more dangerous jobs. Men tend to take less breaks in their career due to motherhood being a big choice that women have to make. And part of that is that men don't have the biological limitation, because, you know, we're fertile throughout life, whereas women, if they want to have kids, they have to have it by a certain age. But I mean, once you get beyond 35, your chances of conceiving reduce substantially.
Which is an age that I think, and again, no evidence, but just from my own anecdotal experience, tends to be an age when you really are taking off in your job and really putting in those foundations as well. It seems almost like quite a pivotal time in a career to have to step away, or not have to, but are stepping away.
Well, that's it. So that it depends on a lot of different things, but I know that one of the issues, I mean, Jordan Peterson spoke about this quite a bit, because he used to work as a psychologist with high-end law firms, and one of the big issues that the law firms had was that they had women coming in their 20s when they just qualified, who were really hardworking, really conscientious, really driven, wanted to get to the top, and would work the 80, 90-hour weeks that are required. Like, there aren't many people out there who are willing to work 80 hours a week, and they would work all those hours, and they would work their way to the top, and then they would get to 30, and they'd go, you know what, I don't want to spend the rest of my life working, I want to have kids, and then they'd leave. And the high-end law firms were really struggling to retain them, and they were bending over backwards to try and retain them, but women were making a choice. And then that obviously affects the rates of pay for men and women, because men tend to have more continuous years of service based on things like that. And then people are going, oh, it's so unequal. But what you're not seeing, that is a significant amount of those cases, there is a man who's working to provide for that woman to facilitate her choice, because she has the
their choice to have a kid.
Their choice to have a kid, but she has an option of a high paying career that she's doing very well at, and she could easily reach the top of, and where they want to keep her in, and they're throwing things at her to try and keep her in, and she still prefers to do that. She still prefers to have a child, and to be at home as a mother, because they could make the choice that the father stays at home and does it. So there is a huge element of female choice, and there's a few things that play into that. So the other thing I was talking about is the way that the figures are skewed. So there's a very small minority of men who are hyper conscientious and don't care about anything other than work, and they work all day, every day, without taking any breaks, and they tend to become CEOs, they tend to become billionaires. And, you know, this is like 0.002% of men. Yeah. But if you put one billionaire in the scenario, it brings up the average income substantially.
Yes.
And there aren't as many women who are prepared to do that as men, generally. And that seems to be about choice, because there aren't that many people who want to do that. You know, most men don't want to do that, but the small number of people who do want to do that tend to be men. So there's lots of things that skew these sort of ideas of disparities. I mean, the thing around disparities, and I'm sure this will get taken out of context for someone. The thing about disparities is there has never been any evidence anywhere throughout history of complete parity between two groups. Whether it's men and women, whether it's white people and black people, or Indians and Chinese, or like I don't know, you know, any of these countries that neighbor next to each other. And if you look at like different countries, there's also been lots of issues with tensions between highly successful minorities who've done far better than the native population, and that's caused like a tension between them, and that's globally with loads of different demographics. I don't have the figures off the top of my head, but I know that Thomas Sowell's done a lot of research into it, and I recommend that everyone reads Thomas Sowell, because it's like mind-blowingly detailed analysis of different disparities. So I don't think... Anyway, this has turned into a really long tangent. And basically, what my point was that sometimes we look at an outcome and say, well, there's an unequal outcome here in terms of the demographics that are represented at the end point, but we don't look at that process. And actually, if you produce completely equal opportunities for everyone, you will not get the same outcome.
Yeah, and that's a perfectly valid statement to have. And also, some of this conversation's focused a little bit on those big numbers of pay, hasn't it, in terms of like there being unequalness. But from my understanding, just from reading the media and stuff, there is plenty of pushback like out there saying actually this isn't a great way of highlighting the gender pay gap for reasons some of which you've just pointed out. But that doesn't wash away, I think, the whole argument. I think that there is still a lot to say in the way that the society is set up. You know, say that couple with a lawyer in the law, that go back to that lady in the law firm. Yeah. What if she was married or not married? What if she was with someone else in that law firm and they decided to have the kid? Now, it would be interesting to find out if in that scenario, would they both be able to go part-time, kind of cover each other's job? And would that be acceptable? So, and like that would be quite an ideal setup, and that's where you would almost want it to go, but we're not there. And if they're making a choice, and we do have to take into account that there is generally certain more than not many females that want to be there for mat leave and want to have that, and not like some people might be like, oh, of course you want mat leave because it's easy. Bloody not easy. Like having a baby around is hard work.
Yeah, absolutely.
And sometimes people...
Nothing I'm saying is to denigrate
no.
the
I'm
extreme
thinking
difficulties of being a mother. Like
I've got other people... I've got other people in my head who I know from my own personal life that lockdown was a massive eye-opener for them, and they just thought, I'm out and about working all the time and you're just home with the kids, and then lockdown happened, and that person, their wife was a nurse, and they went out to work and left him at home. And not many months into lockdown did he come around and be like, I've got this completely wrong. Can I go back to work? Like, this is the hardest thing in the world. And like, sometimes that isn't really be taken on, and like,
what was wrong with
board.
his kids that they were that?
No, it's you'll.
Has he been giving them too much sugar?
If you have children, you will, like, in your future, you'll come back to this and be like, oh yeah, no, actually, it's certainly a lot more draining and mentally draining. I think it's the mental challenge that isn't there.
Yeah,
but those things that come into play, that it's not just the gender pay gap and how you want to explore those figures that are there that I think make it an easier ride in general still for white males in this world. But
so I think both groups have their burdens to bear to some degree, and have their challenges that they will face. And one of the things, I had this debate with one of my lecturers, and partly I was just, that lecturer was a bigot as far as I'm concerned. She was big into her critical race theory and feminist ideology, but the way she manifested that was that she hated white people and men, and to me that's bigotry. But the debate that I got into with her was, it's not clear cut, because if you look at, so people say historically women have been oppressed, and no doubt about that. Historically, humanity has been oppressed by the innate challenges of existence. So I don't think there's anyone who hasn't been oppressed in some way, shape or form. And there's arguments to say that we are oppressed by the constraints of society, by social norms, and so on and so forth. And I think these are valid points to some degree, but also they're often existential issues that we cannot, people can get a bit utopian about how likely they see a resolution to these. And so some of the things that I think men have to put up with a lot more. So men are more likely to be homeless. Men are more likely to commit suicide. Men are more represented in addiction. Men have, throughout history, when men have been conscripted into war and died, men fulfill most of the dangerous jobs. There are a lot of things that men do that, if you talk about, so the conversation around equality often goes, well, women aren't represented enough at the top. And if I've never met anyone that you say, well, do you want just as many female bricklayers? I've never met anyone who says, yeah, we care about that. They're only focused on the things at the top. They don't focus on the men at the bottom. And so I think it gets skewed by creating this idea that men have one position and women have another, when it's a lot more complicated than that. And there are some ways in which women are advantaged over men. There's some ways in which men are advantaged over women. And there are some ways in which both groups are disadvantaged as well. And some of that is biologically instantiated. Some of that is a result of differences in temperament and average temperament, and the choices that people make on average. And when you get a slight difference on average of choices between two different groups, when you play that out over a society of millions of people, it looks quite substantial.
Yeah. Your points there in terms of how men can not suffer, like that's the wrong word. What's the word I'm looking for? How some of the challenges that men face in society, it's there. And like, it goes back to your point, things aren't 100% equal. And you have to be careful of pushing complete utopian arguments. And it's important to raise those points that you raised, because if you hadn't, like, it's kind of, you're missing some of the challenges that men face. But even taking that into account, like, some of the things that jump out to me is like how many of those made those choices for some of those jobs. I'm obviously not including like homeless people and stuff there, but dangerous work. Some people, predominantly men, like chase adrenaline more. Is that a factor? I don't know. Not saying it is, not like it, but that may be sometimes something to do with it. But also, how many? What would be interesting? Absolutely no idea. But I think I'm pretty confident in saying that like men are less represented in rape statistics than women, and that there are some of those oppressions that are ones where they've actively been made victims through men than men. Yeah. And I think there's some of those additional challenges and threats that women face and are conscious of facing that we aren't, and that's also feeding into some of these things.
Well, and that is definitely the case that women are the majority victims of sexual assault and rape, and
domestic abuse, which brings us back to there.
That one we've gotten contentious about in terms of how balanced the issues are. But so no, my argument has not been to say that women have it easy and that there aren't issues that specifically affect women. It's that it's not clear to me that you can say that one group, if we're gonna measure people by groups of male and female, it's not clear to me that one group has it easier than the other. Both groups have their struggles that they have to face, and my concern is with improving things for people in general rather than saying, well, we need to focus on issues for this group or that group, because I don't like the sort of identity politics side of things. And I have to point out that when I spoke about men's issues, you said, well, how much of it's their choice? And when I said that a lot of some of the women's issues were about women's choice, you weren't accepting it. So there's a double standard there, and I feel like I have to point that out.
Yeah. As soon as you said that, I recognised that. But what came out of what you just said, I think, almost feeds right back to my original point. Is that it's important to be aware of these things and take them on board, but not hold them up as your founding principle. Because what we've really unpacked in that conversation was, as you just highlighted, that there are challenges that women face and challenges that men face. But if you don't learn about and understand the feminist female ideologies, like, if you don't open that door of discussion, if you don't take that on board, then you're blind to it. The same as if you don't, and I wasn't really taking into account initially till you raised it, some of the challenges that men face. And if you don't bring that to the table when you're working with these people, then you're blind to it and you're not understanding fully some of the things that these people can be experiencing in life. And that's why I would say, like, a good person in social work, bring it back to that, needs to have an understanding. But as you've highlighted, it would be very dangerous if you are completely led by that and blind to everything else.
Well, so the initial point that I started on with all of this was, so I don't think that, personally, I don't think feminism is the vessel for which to improve things for women. I think that feminism, being an ideology rather than evidence-based, tends to make a lot of choices or a lot of suggestions based on poor analysis, and often actually makes things worse for women. And I think you can.
Hold on a minute. Wait. Yeah. Okay. I'll let you carry on. So I just think equal pay.
It's been illegal to pay people a different wage for the same job in this country for 50 years.
And where does that come off the back of?
So I'm not. Well, I think there's many things. So I think that the degree of responsibility which we attribute feminism for the progression for women is exaggerated, because I think that there are a number of factors that contributed to it, such as improvement in sanitary products availability, improvements in contraception, a decrease in danger overall, because when civilizations were more dangerous, it was easier for men to be out and about in society than it was than it was women because they were at a greater level of risk. And I think that society becoming safer on the whole has enabled women a lot more freedom. And I think sometimes we say, well, feminism won all these things, and actually a lot of it was societal advances, technological advances that were in progress separate from feminism. There is also a distinction between first and second wave feminism, which, you know, I have a lot less criticisms of than the later manifestations of feminism and the modern manifestations of feminism. In the same way, the civil rights movement was a very good thing. Critical race theory, very questionable and contentious. And it's I'm trying to think. I think it might be Thomas Sowell again. I'm a big fan of Thomas Sowell, so I do come back to him quite often. But he has documented how, he has a theory that he's put forward and evidenced quite strongly that over time, movements that may have a sort of righteous cause and a useful function in society, over time they become rackets. And if you look at like groups like Black Lives Matter, they might have had a point at first, and then it turned out they were embezzling loads of money and buying themselves mansions and so on and so forth.
I think I've got to bring this to a wrap because unfortunately I have somewhere else to be. But I think, yes, there is going back to right at the beginning with certain ways of viewing things as a narrative. I think that there is a lot of things there where some people will just go, oh, well, feminism achieved this as in of its own, which it didn't for some of those points you raised. And also like the Second World War had a lot to do with it as well. But it's about unpacking and sparking those debates and getting people to say, yes, we do want this, because if you haven't got people saying this isn't fair and raising those questions and having those debates, even with the moving on of technology, would it have got there if people weren't saying we want this? And so it's attributing at least a degree of it to feminism by the fact that they're saying, like, actually, we just want to be treated equally. And
well, yeah, but we don't know to what degree. I mean, there are probably people out there who do know, but I don't know off the top of my head. I don't have the historical knowledge to know to what degree things were happening separately from the feminist movement on a social level. I think there would probably be some evidence in the fact that the less technologically advanced countries we have now seem to be worse for women's rights in general and women's freedoms. So, like, obviously, if you compare, countries like England, US, the majority of Europe, the sort of West, compare them to countries like, you know, Afghanistan, Syria, some of the sub-Saharan African countries that are very, they are far more patriarchal than the West is, yes, in a very real way. But I don't think they're completely devoid of feminism. I think that there are issues with, I mean, it's complex, and I'm running the risk of really oversimplifying something here, but I think that there is something indicative there in the fact that these societies are both less technologically advanced and less progressive in their attitudes towards women. And interestingly,
because they have not got enough feminist conversation going on in their society to open their eyes.
Well, that's that's debatable but not something I feel qualified to have the debate in.
No, me neither.
I think we'd both be making some pretty massive presumptions there, and
we would,
and we probably have at some points during this conversation. But it's been very interesting, and I'm quite happy that we got into these debates from slightly different perspectives, because that was basically what I was hoping for when I thought of you as a guest, because I know that you are probably slightly more left-wing than me. I'm probably slightly less left-wing than you. I struggle to put myself on the political spectrum because I change my opinions based on evidence all the time, and I'm also a bit more nerdy and data driven than the average person, and spend a lot of time reading research. So I think that it's worthwhile having these discussions, and I think that the debate is useful.
No, I totally agree. I think if anybody does bother to listen to this, one of the important takeaways is very much like that we are not people completely stood up or putting ourselves on pedestals as we know everything that we're discussing about, and like, you should listen to us, we're right, because I mean I may well be on some things, feminism, but not on others, or at least taking into account feminism within your everyday life. But what I take away from conversations with you, Robin, and I hope other people take away from listening to us, is just unpacking certain things a bit further and opening other avenues of thought and just questioning certain beliefs. I think that's really the most important thing, because if you don't do that and you don't sit down with someone who thinks about things slightly different to you, you're never going to learn, you're never going to improve your own knowledge of a situation, and that is probably the most important thing to be doing out there as well, and hopefully people take from this.
Absolutely. And my I sometimes think I misrepresent myself at times, because I feel duty bound to put across an alternative perspective even if I don't hold it necessarily, and so that often involves playing the devil's advocate to some degree. But my objective in any conversation, really, I mean, sometimes it's just about connection and the value of speaking to people, but particularly in conversations like this, is that I hope that at the very least, I go away from the conversation a little smarter than I went in, and hopefully that has the same effect on other people, but they might just go away thinking, fucking hell, Robin's exhausting.
Yeah, I agree. It's a shame we didn't actually wrap up any of those conversations, but
well, that just means
I don't
have to rub anything off the board.
Brilliant.
Because we only skimmed domestic abuse, and we haven't even touched the parsnip.
Exactly. I look forward to parsnip.
Right. Thank you very much, and I look forward to doing it again.
Cheers, feedback.